Neo Games!
Hey there folks, and welcome to Story Stripdown, the show where we strip down the stories from movies, video games, and books to see what worked and what didn't work. I'm Drew from Neo Games, and since I'm currently writing a few of my own stories, my plan is to dig into the classics and my personal favorites to learn from them and improve my own storytelling skills. If you're interested in narrative structures and character development, keep on listening and join me on my learning journey. Today we're going to go way back in time to my childhood in 1991, back to when VGA graphics were amazing, 2 megabytes of RAM was something to brag about, and you needed to edit your config.sys and autoexec.bat files if you wanted to play your games with fancy digital sound effects from your Sound Blaster audio card. In this episode, I want to talk about Wing Commander 2 and the art of the space opera. Wing Commander 2 was released in 1991 and was written by Stephen Beeman and Ellen Guon, directed by Stephen Beeman, and produced by Chris Roberts. As always, there will be spoilers within, so if you haven't already played this game, you might want to spend a few hours on it first. It's available at GOG.com, just for probably a few bucks. Wing Commander 2 is a science fiction flight simulator set in a war between humanity and a race of large warrior cats known as the Kilrathi. In this game, you play a hotshot pilot with a customizable name, though from Wing Commander 3 onwards, he becomes known as Blair because of his distinctive blue hair. So, to make things easy, I'm going to refer to the character as Blair as well. A little bit of background in case you haven't played either Wing Commander 1 or 2. The events of Wing Commander 1 show Blair as a new pilot on a space carrier known as the Tiger's Claw. By the end of the game, he becomes the top pilot and drives the Kilrathi away from a key sector of space. Blair's hero status is cut short in Wing Commander 2, however, as the opening cutscenes show that the Tiger's Claw was destroyed by high-tech Kilrathi stealth fighters, and Blair is wrongly blamed for it, especially by a high-ranking officer named Admiral Tolwyn. Without evidence of the stealth fighters to prove its innocence, Blair is demoted and transferred to a backwater station, far from the war. And this is where Wing Commander 2 starts. 10 years go past, and Blair's talents are wasted doing pointless patrols in a system where nothing happens. Tolwyn's flagship, the Concordia, suddenly shows up one day, attacked by Kilrathi fighters. Blair flies out and saves the day, and eventually ends up being transferred to the Concordia and rejoins the war. On board, he meets old friends from Wing Commander 1, like Angel, Spirit, Doomsday, and a Kilrathi defector called Hobbs. These are all fighter pilot call signs, of course, like Maverick and Goose from Top Gun. Also on board are haters like Tolwyn and Jazz, the top pilot on board the Concordia, who might just be a little bit jealous of Blair. The Concordia is plagued by acts of sabotage and murder, indicating a traitor on board. Then the stealth fighters that ruined Blair's career suddenly resurface, and his continual insistence of their existence makes him more sus to the rest of the crew. Admiral Tolwyn continues to disrespect him, Jazz is relentless with his sarcastic remarks, and all the while, the war effort goes poorly, no matter how many enemy ships Blair shoots down. In the last act, Jazz is revealed as the traitor, Blair defeats him in a dogfight before he's brought back for justice, and then finally, Blair flies a suicide attack against the Kilrathi High Command and he blows up their gigantic space station, the Kathitrak Mang, thus proving his worth all over again. Why this narrative design works so well is because it puts a lot of human drama into the world building. The story structure is divided into smaller campaigns set within a different star system, where each campaign contains a handful of missions. But unlike games like Sonic the Hedgehog, where levels can look drastically different with green hills or casino-inspired zones, every level in Wing Commander 2 looks exactly the same because it's all set in space. It doesn't really matter which star system you're in, because you're still flying around in the same pitch-black emptiness of space. It would feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again, and this is largely true when it comes to the actual gameplay of dogfighting in space, except that the integration of the human drama gives you a different storyline to focus on, and this is strong enough to make each star system, or chapter of the game, feel different. The game does this by inserting cutscenes in between each mission, And while the cutscenes are always the same few areas on board the Concordia, like the hangar, the bridge, the observation deck, and the barracks, it's the story being told about the relationships Blair has with the other pilots that brings life and drama to the game. For example, the Niven system is ostensibly about Blair's transfer to the Concordia, where he has to run some scouting and delivery missions. But what the story sets up here is the discrimination Blair suffers from the other pilots because of his wrongfully earned reputation as the guy who allowed the Tiger's Claw to be destroyed. Niven is also the start of the traitor subplot, when a crew member is mysteriously murdered. Luckily, Blair was away on a mission when it happened, and thus escapes blame. Next is the Gorakar system, and here the story steers towards Blair's prejudice towards Hobbs, the Kilrathi defector. Flying missions of Hobbs forces Blair to see him as more as an individual and not just a generic member of the enemy species. And it's a nice way to set up the concept that in war, both sides can easily fall into the trap of just generalizing the other side as a faceless enemy. More about this later. In every system, there is always a different subplot going on, and it's always at a personal level. It'll be about your close friend Spirit being blackmailed with the life of her captured fiancé, or Angel and Blair's developing romance and her inner conflict between doing her job as wing commander of the Concordia and sending her lover on a mission where he might not return. There will always be something going on to push the player to complete the next mission, not just for the thrill of shooting down enemy spacecraft in a gameplay, but also to find out how the story develops in the cutscenes. This focus on micro-stories gives Wing Commander 2 a narrative depth that many similar games don't have. A comparison can be made with the 1993 game Star Wars X-Wing, also a sci-fi flight simulator. In both games, you're a hotshot pilot that eventually saves the day by blowing up an enemy space station, the Katithrak Mang in Wing Commander 2, and the Death Star in X-Wing. But that's where the similarities end. Unlike Wing Commander 2, X-Wing's story is played out on a macro level, highlighting key events in the Rebellion's effort to uncover and destroy the Death Star. X-Wing's narrative focuses on events and lone characters narrating mission briefings, and includes very little depictions of characters interacting with one another. Because of this, X-Wing's story unfolds more like a documentary than a dramatic story, and that difference is what makes Wing Commander 2's world feel a lot more alive to people who haven't already read all the lore in the fandom wiki pages. The difference between the two games is like watching Saving Private Ryan and watching a documentary about World War II. The micro perspective gives you the space opera drama that a macro view cannot.
I'm not guilty, sir. I won't sign it.
Something Wing Commander 2 does that it didn't do in the first game is to give Blair his own voice and personality. In Wing Commander 1, he's basically a proxy for the player and does very little beyond quietly nodding and smiling in conversations with other pilots. He's a silent protagonist, much like the player character in Grand Theft Auto 3. But in Wing Commander 2, Blair finally gets a voice and a dramatic need, and this makes him all the more compelling. What's his dramatic need? Redemption. To prove he's not responsible for the loss of the Tiger's Claw, and that he deserves to be at the front lines flying with the other aces. The setup of his character is quite interesting, as the writers introduce him from two different perspectives. In the opening cutscenes, we hear from the Kilrathi first. The Emperor and the Crown Prince are talking about their plans for conquest, and Blair is brought up very specifically as a thorn in their plans.
And what of the human pilot who has caused us so much trouble?
Those fools blame him for the loss of the Tiger's Claw. He will never fly a fighter again.
Excellent. Without him, the Terrans cannot stand against us. Soon, Earth itself will be in our grasp.
As you can see, Blair has been singled out by the Kilrathi for blowing up tons of their ships, and he's regarded as a key element to plan around. If he was in that room, he'd get quite the ego boost. In the very next scene, however, we see that Blair's fellow humans are far less appreciative of his contributions to the war. Listen to Admiral Tolwyn rip into Blair.
Without your flight recorder as evidence, the court couldn't convict you of anything but negligence. But I know the destruction of the Tiger's Claw was your fault, and I still believe that you're guilty of treason.
I like the way writers Beeman and Guan set up Blair's backstory. You get a positive version from the enemies, then a negative version from your own faction. Starting from the enemy perspective sets up the tangible consequences from Blair's actions in Wing Commander 1, And then the human perspective sets up the dramatic conflict with his peers that will drive Wing Commander 2. From the very beginning of the game, you already have a clear goal other than the generic defeat the enemy and win the war. The writers followed this up by placing Blair in the position of a frontline pilot without any real say in the big picture strategy. You get given missions by Tolwyn and Angel, and then you have to go complete them. At no point does anyone ask Blair for his opinion on what the Concordia and its pilots should do, even though he's obviously the most talented pilot on board. Furthermore, absolutely nobody, not even his lover Angel, believes his claims about the Kilrathi stealth fighters, even though he's seen more action than anyone else. Sound familiar? If you look at the target audience for this game, you've got teen school kids and young working adults. Teens whose parents don't believe them when they claim that their school teacher unreasonably picks on them and marks down their homework. And working adults who see problems in their work projects but get repeatedly told, just shut up and do your job. Big decisions like that are way beyond your pay grade. This creates an instant connection with the target audience, much like when the Disney princess breaks out into song during the first act and sings, I want adventure in the great wide somewhere. Blair's situation, despite being in a science fiction space war, is rooted in everyday conflicts. Nobody believes him. No matter how many ships he blows up or how many transports he successfully defends, it seems like the people in charge just won't listen to him. And he's just one pilot out of many, flying one mission out of many that get flown every day. And even if Blair has a 100% success rate, that's not enough to change the tide of battle if his peers aren't pulling their weight, or his commanders keep making bad tactical choices. There's a feeling of helplessness, where one's actions are never enough to make a difference, almost like a Cassandra complex. It's not a setup that's unique to Wing Commander 2, as there are plenty of video game protagonists who are represented as frontline worker bees just doing their best. But it's a setup that consistently works, because it's a timeless problem that we can always relate to, much like the Disney princess who dreams of a bigger world.
Kazra, what is happening on Gorakar?
The rebels have taken the planet, my lord.
How can these scum turn against their rightful lords? I cannot let them gain my stealth fighter technology.
Another key way Wing Commander 2 differs from Wing Commander 1 is in the amount of insight we have into the Kilrathi side of the war. We never see or hear from them directly in Wing Commander 1, other than hearing Kilrathi taunts and screams on the intercom as you fight them. Wing Commander 2 opens this up with the occasional cutscene to highlight what's happening on the other side. This adds more intrigue and depth to the human versus Kilrathi conflict. And just as Blair starts to view Hobbs as more than just a faceless enemy pilot in the Gorakar missions, this narrative device helps the player do the same thing with the Kilrathi warriors. You start to see the amount of pressure being heaped onto Prince Thrakath to win the war by both the Emperor and his bloodthirsty cousin Kazra. You see Thrakath's frustrations balancing his duty to act as a figurehead back in Kilrathi High Command and his desire to seek glory in the front lines. You can relate to these issues and these characters, and now the Kilrathi and human conflict is not a simple red versus blue affair. Halo 2 is another game that uses this storytelling device well, 13 years after Wing Commander 2 did it. After experiencing Halo 1 entirely from humanity's perspective, Halo 2 begins with a 2.5-minute cutscene from the Covenant perspective, as the High Prophets berate the Arbiter for failing to defeat the humans in Halo 1.
When you first saw Halo, were you blinded by its majesty?
Blinded?
Paralyzed? Dumbstruck?
No.
Yet the humans were able to evade your ships, land on the sacred ring, and desecrate it with their filthy footsteps.
Halo 2 builds on this later in the game, as you even get to play as the Arbiter trying to seek redemption. This adds a nice dimension to the story, to experience the drama on both sides of the conflict, especially since both the Arbiter and Master Chief end up working together to defeat the big bad Gravemind. Okay, let's sum up what I've learned from Wing Commander 2. 1. Little personal stories add depth to big war stories. By portraying the interpersonal relationships between characters, writers Beeman and Guan bring the human and Kilrathi conflict to life and adds color to what could have been repetitive battles in the blackness of deep space. 2. And I can already tell this will be a recurring learning, but giving your protagonist relatable traits is a good way to connect players with a situation that's a lot more fantastic than regular life, and a good way to have your players empathize with the main character. 3. War stories often fall into the trap of becoming a simple us versus them conflict, and it can help create depth by giving some insight into what happens on the other side of the battle lines. War is rarely as black and white as good guys versus bad guys, so it's a good narrative device to take occasional peeks into the other side. Thank you for listening to the show. If you enjoyed the way I dig into stories, please follow for more story strip downs. I'd love to see your thoughts on Wing Commander 2, so please drop some comments on what you think of it. Join us next week as we look into sequels, using Blade 2 and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes as examples. This episode of Story Strip Down is written, produced, and hosted by me, Drew Pan. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on X as NeoTeagle Games. That's NeoTeagleGames. You can also find my game Gloom and Doom on Steam and all major consoles. It's a horror comedy visual novel about an ancient wraith and a teenage antichrist trying to prevent the apocalypse. If horror fantasy is not your thing, try my comedy novel Toxic Boss Fight, available on Amazon.com. This one's about office politics and the quest to find meaning at work. Take care, everyone. Keep on reading and writing.